Okay, I thought I'd start off with, because there's been so much talk about civil war in this country. I thought we would first talk about, wait a minute. That's not what I want. Well, you're going to have to do that. Yeah, I hope you're, what are you seeing? Are you seeing 2 slides or 1?
One.
Okay, so we're going to keep it here. Here on our home screen, we're seeing 2, this one and the next one. So there's been so much talk around Russia and Ukraine about sphere of influence, and that what about sphere of influence? It's always been respected in world history, and we've certainly seen that sphere of influence as we go through the Silk Road. There were, and as we read when we did the Silk Road, tributary states that paid homage to China. So that was no big deal. And here were all the kingdoms that paid tribute to China. And that's something that we've had coming down through history. Now, the thing that makes it relevant is Putin says, yeah, but what about me? I have a sphere of influence too. That's why I'm covering some of those. And in addition to political sphere of influence, there's cultural spheres of influence, it turns out. I found this list very interesting. And of course, here's a Slavosphere. And there have been Russian nationalists who've been pushing Putin to preserve the Slavosphere. And arguably, the sense of the Slavosphere is what got us into World War I. It was Serbia fighting with Austria over Bosnia, and Russia felt compelled to defend their fellow Slavs, and Germany backed up their fellow Germans in Austria, and off we went to war. So we had a sphere of influence, and this is our sphere of influence. Monroe Doctrine. We learned about it when we were in high school. Here's the sphere of influence during the age of colonialism that was discussed when we did the Silk Road history and the various spheres of influence.
Who's green?
Huh?
Who's green and who's, you can't see that, who's sphere?
So I am not going to dwell on this, Aiko. If you have questions, I don't want to break this down. But I think it's appearing a little yellowish on my screen, so that's why I'm confused. I think it is Britain for Egypt, and of course, eventually Italy takes over Libya. But this is 1897. Yeah. Okay. On to the next. And then we had the Great Game, and we followed the Great Game as we went through the Silk Road book, and we eventually learned that Russia and Britain in 1907 called off the Great Game, and Britain said, look, we'll take control of everything east of this line, and Russia, you can have influence in Persia, northwest of this line. And this is captured in a cartoon. The Great Game had gone on for really 100 years, and it was Britain being paranoid that Russia was going to take over their claim to India. In World War II, Germany and Japan had an agreement of what their spheres of influence were going to be after they defeated everybody. And that's, of course, theoretical. There is a what if novel written called The Man in the High Castle, and written by Philip K. Dick, and he imagined what if Germany and Japan had won? What if the Axis had won? And this is how they were going to divide the world. And notice Philip Dick divides America in this what if novel. And he divides it, and it's been a TV series, by the way, which is very interesting because you see the Japanese part of the United States in tension with the Nazi-controlled eastern two-thirds, and then a lot goes on in Cannon City in the neutral zone. So spheres of influence. By the way, I'm keeping my eye on your little pictures. Anybody want to raise their hand and comment, interrupt me. We had a really good interactive session last week, and I want to be interrupted. So this is Putin's gripe. Putin's gripe is that Russia, Soviet Union had this great sphere of influence. And I think I told you all, he complained to Kissinger when Kissinger was a business consultant in St. Petersburg in the 1990s. And he was surprised to find that Kissinger, who is a realist, agreed that Russia's Soviet Union sphere of influence had been collapsed too much. Too much. And today you have realists arguing the same thing, that Ukraine is in Russia's sphere of influence. The most outspoken of these in the foreign affairs community is Stephen Merksheimer. And he argues that, hey, let's be realistic. There should be a sphere of influence. And you've heard Kissinger weigh in on his side, that we need to negotiate and recognize that Ukraine can't join NATO. And then even the EU has a sense of regional sovereignty, and whether they want it or not, because they're certainly getting a lot of boats full of desperate Africans coming across the Mediterranean. But they've added new members, and there's some possible members, although Turkey has been held at arm's length for so long that they're fed up. They don't think they're ever going to be able to get in to the EU, and they're looking in other directions. So the spheres of influence, we've been talking about China and what China's grievances are. Well, China complains about 150 years of shame, and being divided by all these powers. And you can see the color coding there: the British zone, the French zone, the Japanese zone, the Russian zone, and the German zone. By the way, you can still get Tsingtao beer that was produced in Tsingtao by the Germans when they had that colony, Rudy, that in brown there. We have a latecomer, Mike Stein. Okay, so this has been China's beef all along, is that other nations carved them up. And there's this famous cartoon of all the empires that were dividing China. And they're carrying this grudge with them now, and it's fueling the nationalism that we're starting to encounter with a nationalist like Xi. He's really the first Chinese leader since Mao to be a strong nationalist. Deng Xiaoping had advised China to bide its time. Yes, Bob.
Well, I need to be reminded, when did China make its land grab of Tibet? And
I think
we talk about,
I think in the 1700s,
okay.
as I remember. I'm pretty sure.
John, the movie 7 Years in Tibet tells the story that it was really in the 40s, the 1940s, that the Tibetan leaders had to flee Tibet. So it may have been a progressive thing, but I think that, the Dalai Lama fled Tibet into northern India, Dharamsala, in I think 48 or 9.
Well, I think it was the mid 50s, but I could be wrong. But Jim Tysell might know. He's with us today.
He's right, and you're wrong, John.
Okay.
49.
Okay. And Jim has a lot of experience in Tibet. So,
Well, I've had an interest, but I have a friend who was of Tibetan ancestry and have been involved in that.
Yeah. Okay, thanks. I'm glad we could settle that as a community.
I mean, it's possible that there were stuff going back to the 18th century. I mean, actually, Tibet was originally more of a Mongolian associated. Their language and stuff is more related to the Mongols than it is the Chinese, the Han Chinese. But China's always considered it, probably belonging to them or should belong to them.
Yeah, and I think they shared the Tibetan form of Buddhism too. I think that was part of it. Anyway, interesting. So where was the United States in all this? Well, the United States, you didn't see them at the table carving up China, and they promoted an open door policy. So they had a possibility at one point to being the colonial exception and becoming friends with China. But we couldn't resist imperialism, and we went into the Philippines, and we can see from this cartoon that the Philippines were considered some kind of stepping stone to China for all the trade and things we could do in China.
Don't forget Puerto Rico.
And Puerto Rico. Thank you, Jim. Jim,
Cuba for a while, if you really want to get into the weeds.
Jim's aunt Ruth was an activist in Puerto Rico.
She was in prison for 19 months in
Wow.
in Puerto Rico in the early 50s, but we can talk about that another time.
Yeah, thanks. This is great. I really enjoy the interactions. Thank you. Keep them coming. All right. So America and the Philippines, and we were plenty racist when it came. We were going to subdue them with the rifle and convert them with education and religion. There were some opponents, remarkably Mark Twain, who was anti-American imperialism. Good for him. And so what replaces this sphere of influence and protects against a sphere of influence? Does anybody know what R2P is?
Sounds like he belongs in Star Wars.
Okay, here's
Peace.
R2P. The responsibility to protect. Responsibility to shorthand for responsibility to protect. It was adopted by the United Nations in 2005 at a World Summit, and it was reaction basically to the genocide that had gone on in the Balkans and Rwanda, the war crimes, the ethnic cleansing, crimes against humanity. And it's a big deal, a change in a global responsibility. I think Clinton has said one of his great regrets is his inaction in the Rwandan genocide that took place on his watch. And then in Bosnia, Srebrenica, the genocide, 1995. Finally, he'd had enough. And in 1999, they intervened in Kosovo. We happened to be driving with a Muslim cab driver on a 6-hour ride in China. And Madeleine Albright was the Secretary of State. And it was under her watch that we started bombing Belgrade to force the Serbians to back off on their aggressive ethnic cleansing. And the cab driver thought that Madeleine Albright was like a hero to him, because he was Muslim and the Kosovars are Muslim. So it was a very strange moment. He also greatly admired Kissinger, but he hated Jews.
Yeah.
So we had to break the news to him that Kissinger was Jewish. He was dizzy for a while.
Madeleine Albright Jewish too.
But she didn't know it. When did she find out? I'm not sure when she found out.
And then he found out that Marx was Jewish. I didn't believe all the Jews.
Yeah, we had to, yeah, that's right. Thank you, Ike. Then we had to tell him Karl Marx was Jewish.
Did he not object
Vladimir
to the
Lenin?
fact that the bombing of Belgrade resulted in some deaths at the Chinese embassy?
Yeah, oh yeah, they made hay out of that for sure. And he was Muslim. He was from a minority tribe out at west in Gansu province. But the Chinese themselves, they didn't care much whether it was Muslim or not, but he did, because he was a minority. It was interesting though, Putin's beef, his grievance, if you read his biography, he was just coming to major power. And for him, this was an insult, our bombing of Belgrade, because of that Slavic connection that we talked about earlier. And he saw the fact that it had not been blessed by the United Nations. Clinton knew and Madeleine Albright knew if they bought the intervention to the United Nations, Russia would veto it because of that Slavic connection. So this in Putin's mind was the first time he saw international law being circumvented and the United Nations being circumvented. He's going to have other beefs. Iraq, when we went in without UN approval, those two episodes of American freelancing arguably could have influenced the way he evolved.
John, what about not Kosovo, but Chechnya? They had two wars there, and it seems like right after Putin got into power, he blew up a couple of apartment blocks in Moscow to justify invading Chechnya. Didn't that happen?
Well, he blew up all of Grozny. So
before he did that, he blew up a couple of apartment houses in Moscow to justify it.
That is a tantalizing possibility. But beyond that, he destroyed Chechnya to save it. And in the process, though, he gained the loyalty unexpectedly of Chechen warlords. And Chechens are now fighting in Ukraine. Go figure. But Putin knows how to cultivate warlords. That's what we know about the ruthlessness of Putin. The other interesting thing is the African Union was, because of what happened in Rwanda, they were early cheerleaders for this responsibility to protect and the right of the international community to intervene, because they were feeling, like Clinton, they were feeling guilty that Rwanda had happened on their watch. So what is the responsibility to protect? There are three pillars. The state where there's mischief going on has the responsibility to stop it if it's intramural ethnic cleansing. The second pillar is if they don't, the international community offers assistance to the country so they can exercise their full control and protect minorities from being cleansed. And if they don't take action or can't take action, then a collective response from outside, an intervention of other states, is the third pillar of the responsibility to protect. So this allows actual military intervention. It was Secretary General Kofi Annan who guided this. He was African, and I think he was influenced by Rwanda. But he got this through and got it accepted as a new norm in international order. A few commentators have said this is the most important shift in our conception of sovereignty since 1648, and after the 30 Years' War, the Treaty of Westphalia. Another, Louise Arbour, says it's the most important and imaginative doctrine to emerge for decades. So how does this apply to Ukraine? Do we have a responsibility to protect in Ukraine now? And by many people's definition, certainly Timothy Snyder, he gave talk that laid out 9 points where Russia has ticked off the box on 9 issues that qualify what he's doing in Ukraine as genocide. It includes things like moving women and children to out of their country to another country. Yes, Bob.
Well, I was just wondering if you or anybody else knows whether Putin has used the R2P argument to protect, as he sees it, the inflicted Russian minorities.
Yes,
in Ukraine.
Yes, he has, and I'll mention that in a later slide. But he definitely has, and so what Bob's getting at is the Russian speakers in Donetsk and Luhansk, and apparently there was some changes in school curriculum. I'm not an expert on it, but he didn't make it up. But realize there are plenty of Russian speakers who were perfectly happy in Ukraine, including Vladimir Zelensky, who is a Russian speaker. He grew up in a village that was just liberated by the offensive in the north by the Ukrainian army. And Timothy Snyder has a lot to say about this he thinks it is a misuse of R2P. Anyway, has possibly some relevance now. It's hard for us to initiate any action on our R2P because the way the UN is run, the Security Council, there are 5 countries that get vetoes, and Russia would veto even overwhelming majorities that they'll veto. And that's not unprecedented because there's overwhelming majorities in the United Nations for us relenting on our sanctions of Cuba, and for us to stop backing Israel in every situation. So we have used our veto against overwhelming majorities often. So Russia would not be the first, and everybody knows that that's what they would do. But you've heard about votes at the United Nations. Those are votes in the UN General Assembly, where every country has a vote, but it's non-binding, and the UN General Assembly cannot initiate military action. For instance, they can only basically come up with a popularity contest and use the leverage of public opinion, but nothing binding. And they did vote on Russia's attack in Ukraine and had overwhelming majority. I think only 5 countries voted in favor of Russia, maybe even 3. But there were 30 abstentions. But the second time that happened, there were fewer abstentions. So there's some progress there. It's important to know that this norm was just set. It's not in a treaty. It's become just a part of precedent, the way that the British legal system is set up. There's a precedent and it's followed, and now it's customary. Most states find it a binding arrangement. So it's kind of unusual. There's never been any formal ratification or consent, but it is now generally acknowledged to be an international obligation. How has it been used? It's been invoked 80 times in Security Council resolutions, 50 times by the Human Rights Council, 13 times in the General Assembly votes, and it's even been packed into the Geneva Convention. And here was Bob Oxenburgh's point. It can be tricky and abused as a pretext for aggression, as we said. And Russia did evoke it when they went into Crimea, saying that Russian-speaking Crimeans were being discriminated against, and they're invoking it now for those two provinces. All right. There's another argument about Ukraine I just want to throw in tangentially. There was a treaty, a formal treaty, signed treaty, the Budapest Memorandum. And under the Budapest Memorandum, Ukraine agreed to give up their nuclear weapons. Ukraine had, as part of the Soviet Union, nuclear weapons stored there. And they agreed to give up those nuclear weapons. And what they received was a commitment specifically from the United States and Great Britain and Russia to respect the independence and sovereignty of Ukraine. So obviously, Russia is in violation of that. But we have, in addition to just a human responsibility, and the responsibility to protect under the United Nations, because we're signatories to this treaty, we also, in addition, have a moral responsibility in addition. So if people are arguing what are we doing in Ukraine, there we go. Yeah, Bob.
My question is, the word independence, respect the independence of Ukraine. I'm just being devil's advocate here, but inviting them or potentially inviting them into the EU or into NATO does not really come out of the head. It doesn't really comply with its idea of independence.
Well, I think there's certainly a difference between the EU and NATO. So you'll remember Austria at the end of World War II was occupied just like Germany was. And there was an agreement with Khrushchev around 1955 that Austria could no longer be occupied, that the four powers would leave, but Austria would never join NATO, but they could join the EU. So independence, in the sense that you're using it, Bob, for sure, might apply to NATO, and there'd be an argument for that. But given the Austrian precedent, I think they still should be allowed to join the EU. And you'll remember in 2014, what kicked off the whole maiden revolt that eventually saw the coup, and you could call it a coup because Yankovic had been elected, that saw him leave power and he fled the country and hasn't been seen since. He was a marked man. And that was all over his backpedaling on an agreement to join the EU. He had agreed to it, signed a memorandum of understanding. He was Putin's guy. And we go back to the election 10 years before that, when Putin intervened on his side and poisoned the orange candidate with ricin, right? That caused this.
It was dioxin.
That
was dioxin.
A dioxin that caused the terrible acne. I don't know if you remember those. So Yankovic and Putin were tight, going back to 10 years before that. But when Yankovic signed a memorandum of understanding with the EU, Putin went nuts and said, no, you've got to backtrack. You've got to join the economic union between all the former Soviet states that Putin was organizing. And we saw a shadow of that at the Shanghai Cooperation Council that met in where did they meet? In Tajikistan, right? Yeah, and that's what Putin wanted Ukraine to join, along with Kazakhstan and Tajikistan. But Ukraine didn't want to, and obviously their population, the vast majority of them, are looking towards Europe. They always, the Western part always has looked towards Europe. And that whole history is interesting, and maybe we can review that at some point in the future for those of you that weren't on board when we did it a while back. Anyway, that's what happened with the Maidan, Ukraine wanting to join the EU and him objecting to that very thing. So Bob, maybe he thought that word independent did not apply to the EU, and that he'd had no leverage in Kiev, but he did in Crimea, and he took it. All right, move on. All right, so we didn't really talk about this much last week, but it emerged in one of our emails that pop up at the end of a session. And the question was asked, today in America, is it worse than the 1960s? And I think a number of you think it is. And there was a show, a video about the coming Civil War. I think there's another point of view there, but I'm sure we'll have a robust discussion about that today. But I'm going to evoke Yuval Harari. Our group, the two Bobs, Harold, will have read this book, 21 Lessons for the 21st Century. Ramsey picked it out as something we should spend 6 months digesting, and we did. Yuval Harari, though, his most famous book, his breakthrough book is Sapiens, where he looks at the prehistory of Homo sapiens in a unique way. Homo Deus looks at the way Homo sapiens have used religion to explain what's going on around them. He's a big thinker, and here's what he says about what's been happening in this country. First of all, to open the discussion, the average conservative today is more liberal on many issues than a liberal was 60 years ago. So we're talking about our lifetime, some of us graybeards. This is our lifetime. And we have to agree, there's been a lot of evolution, particularly on something like gay marriage. Now, Yuval Harari is gay himself. He is Israeli, and it's been kind of tough for him. But Israel certainly has come to terms with him, and he's an accepted public personality. So gay marriage leaps and bounds. Now, here's what he says specifically about the question, which is worse. In the 60s, it seemed like Western democracies were falling apart. The ideological battles that we're having then, we were fighting over civil rights. There were still a number of countrymen that didn't think African Americans deserved a full civil rights. The sexual revolution, the feminist movement, all that was in play. There was more violence. There were assassinations of prominent people. And in 1968, with all the violence in the streets and the Democratic National Convention in Chicago, you could easily imagine that the United States was coming apart at the seams. But it wasn't just the United States. Paris was chaos. The students had pulled up the paving stones and blockaded the streets. And so I look at this moment today to see what we're fighting about, and I think I'm on Harari's side. And in the 60s, it seemed like the Soviet Union would last forever, but obviously it didn't. And right now, he doesn't think that we're in a hopeless situation. Technology has certainly given us a run for our money, but we need to teach ourselves how to manage it and how to use it. So my question is, do you think Harari's too optimistic? Do you think I'm too optimistic? Is Harari worried about the right things?
Let's see what happens tonight.
All right. And all this hand-wringing about democracy, there's still plenty of strong support for democracy. Yes, Harold.
I was going to comment that I think we're safer now than we were in the 60s. I mean, in the 60s, Angela Davis was a terrorist and she was on Hoover's 10 most wanted list. They're now having a retrospective exhibit in the Oakland Museum praising her to the skies.
There you go. There you go. Okay. So we hear that the millennials are down on democracy, but the statistics, the polling is still pretty good, and certainly in the last 50 years, there's been a movement towards democracies. Now, in the last 10 years, there's been some backpedaling. I don't deny that. And certainly the autocracies represent large numbers of people. China in particular, Xi is certainly more of an autocrat than who was, for instance, 15 years ago. And certainly Russia has moved more autocratic direction, as has Turkey, as has India. Yes, Bob.
Well, I was just going to add India. Modi, I mean, yes, it prides itself as the world's largest democracy. And it is, I guess. But Modi is pretty autocratic. We were having dinner with some Christian Indians and Sikh Indians the other night, and they were all suggesting that a Hindu, that it was terrific that a Hindu was selected as Prime Minister of Great Britain, and that was extremely unlikely that anyone other than a Hindu could run India right now. And in other words, they have great concerns for their democracy.
Yeah. The other South Asian with a portfolio in the British cabinet is Suella Braverman. The name you don't immediately realize that she's a Hindu, but she has as Home Secretary, she has really caused concern with her anti-immigrant statements. And in particular, she's being challenged with the boat people coming across from France. And she is showing no compassion and raising hackles. So it is interesting, isn't it, that there are some immigrants that once they get in, they pull up the ladder, so nobody can follow them. Okay. And here's a map of before and after. So these are the democracies, and the autocracies certainly cover a large swath of the world, and democracy and so over the last, is that 40, has grown. Just look at the different, just the increase in light blue. Now, sure, some are debatable, like India, like Pakistan, but a lot more blue than there was back then. So I'm getting down to talking. I'm going to go a couple of minutes over so I can get through the data that the University of Maryland compiled, their program for public consultation. And they have found that Democrats and Republicans and independents agree on 150 issues. So I'm not quite sure what the Civil War would be over. But I'll whiz through these and just throw out percentages. 61% on abortion, 71% on gay marriage. Oops, this isn't good. I'm off the screen. Gun control, assault weapons, databases for registering, vote by mail, 60%, Medicaid, Medicare for all, 69%, legalizing pot, 69%. If you had told us back in the 60s that that would be possible, we would have never believed you, I'll tell you that. Racial justice, 87% believe that it should be discussed. 71% are for raising taxes on the wealthiest 2%. Then there's just a bunch of statements. That was big majority, but almost 2/3 in many cases. But here you have at least on these following statements, a majority of where Republicans and Democrats both agree. Fixing Social Security so the rich pay more, increasing aid to poor people, reducing greenhouse gases, reversing money in politics, Citizens United, rejoining the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And we'll talk about that when we finally get back to China. What a own goal that was for us to pull out of that, because that was a mechanism for us to put China in a box. And when we pulled out, China was no longer in a box. Roll back Trump taxes, tax cuts. And we need politicians who will pay attention to this stuff. Harari says from outside looking in, it's hard for him to understand what the difference between Democrats and Republicans are. He thinks these hot button issues like abortion and gun control, that in the long term, and man, he thinks in terms of thousands of years, not decades. In the long term, that's small stuff. So he asked, if you're going to have a civil war here, what's it going to be about? Are we going to destroy the American Republic over quibbles and gun control and environmental pollution and who gets to go into what toilet? So I think the root of this problem, I just want to end with this, is just to look at the psychological aspect of what may be going on to explain the anger we're dealing with. Diversity in the public space is only really 57 years old if you date it back to the civil rights. We talk about this great republic being over 200 years old, but this diverse republic is really where people really have to figure out how to live with each other, is really only 57 years, which is just a little bit more than half of my lifetime. We're the first really diverse democracy. We're not the first diverse empire by any means. Ottomans were good at that, but we're the first diverse democracy. But the clock didn't start really until 1965. So I want to talk about a psychological concept from Freud. He talks about the narcissism of small differences. And he noticed, looking at community, that the more they share, the more they have in common, the more they have to get upset about, and interpersonal feuds, and hypersensitivity to minor differences, And this is not just Freud, this is anthropologists as well. And I'll just say, along with Rudy, who's the former president of our Lake Association, we certainly have a lot of heat over small differences in our community. And it just seems like over the last 57 years, we've found a lot of reasons to take issue over small differences. So I'm out of time. It's we started late, so we can run a little bit over for people to make comments, but I rest my case.
John,
Yes, Jim.
I just wanted to correct something.
Yes.
China started their military activity into Tibet in around 4950, in 1950. The Dalai Lama didn't actually flee over the Himalayas until 59.
That's what I thought. But the original question was, when did China claim Tibet?
Yeah, I'm
I-
sure they
I
claimed it
think
for
that's
centuries.
I think that goes back a couple of centuries.
Right. And the other thing is that it's John Mearsheimer, not Stephen.
Thank you. Thank you.
As far as Civil War, I don't see Civil War happening. I'm not sure what that means. Is it an armed conflict? Is it something different?
Yeah, I'm not sure what it means either. In addition to Civil War, the other word that's been bandied about is secession. Could there be major secession in the country? And I don't know what people would feel so aggrieved that they want to start another country. But depending on how the election goes tonight, we all might.
A little harder to do than it was 150 years ago.
Yeah.
But
Yes,
I think
certainly the state of-
social media business has got everybody stirred up, because it's a lot easier to say nasty things to each other through a computer screen and semi-anonymously than it is face to face.
Yeah, I noticed that at the very beginning, when the very sweetest people I know would send me a harsh email saying something that I know they'd never say to my face.
John, I've heard it said that if you take 3 issues out, gay marriage, guns, and abortion, you remove 90% of the contention between people, between the Republicans and Democrats, which is interesting because, there's the economy, there's so many other kind of big things, but those 3 items are like a 90% factor.
Yeah. I had hoped in a way that the reversal of Roe might have taken abortion out of elections, because right now somebody like Trump, who is the most unchristian person you can imagine, gets the Christian vote, 15% of the population head start just on the abortion issue. And it may not be a negative to send it back to the states and let it. I understand that means that some women are going to have to get transportation, and that might be impossible, and I'm sorry for that, but I'm just looking for a silver lining. And if we stop ceding the Christian vote people like Trump, that would
Oh,
be.
Johnny, I have to say, being a Christian, John MacArthur said that all evangelicals are not Christians. And so, this evangelical vote that everyone, says are Christians, many of them aren't. They don't even believe that God is the superior being. So, please don't say all Christians, because that's not true.
Okay, I guess my point is, Shigeko, back in the days of slavery, for instance, people who wanted to change things for the better, the abolitionists, made partners with the religious community. And they together, they successfully guided us away from slavery. I think if you look at education reform, that was a combination of the left, if you will, liberals, people who wanted change, for looking for ways to improve, even utopians, and Christians allied together for education reform. So I'm kind of a utopian, and it would really be nice to make common cause with Christians. Yes, Jim.
I guess I don't see linking religion with progressive ideas. The end of slavery was not because Christians in the North believed in abolition. After all, 600,000 lives later, and the last large slave-holding empire fell into a Jim Crow, later Jim Crow, etc.
You're breaking up, Jim.
I think your example.
You're
I am. Well, then I'll stop. I'll stop talking. I can hear myself well.
So let me just say it another way that you might find more satisfactory. At least we wouldn't have to cede people who self-describe as religious to Trump, that there would be more in play if there wasn't a hot button issue like abortion.
Well, John, I think you might be missing the underlying issue. Perhaps beneath abortion is the broader replacement problem of, as they see it, of white Christians or white evangelicals. I'm not sure how to phrase that. There's the threat that way of life is changing.
Yeah, I would certainly concede that you wouldn't get every self-identified evangelical to suddenly vote for social change. I concede that, but there certainly is a sliver where abortion really is the number one and only issue. There was a movement, was it Jacob's ladder, young evangelicals who did have kind of other utopian ideas. And I think Obama was courting them at one point. Okay, folks. Well, we're definitely over. And Jeannie, did you have something? Oh, you were waving goodbye.
Yeah.
So it's nice to have you come down from Washington for this.
I love being here. This is just really fascinating and really well done. Thank you, John, so much for
Okay.
sharing all your wisdom, and everybody too. Bye.
Now we got a good group.
Yeah.
All right, see y'all.